Hello and welcome. My name is Sria and I am head of research initiatives at the Paul Mellon Center. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the building center. And before I start, I want to say a big thank you to the Paul Mellon Center team and more than anything else, my co-conveners, Khairani, Barokka, Oka, and Kenny Fries, who you'll hear from very soon in virtual and in-person format. So just to give you a little bit of context, I know some of you have been with us for this entire series. Disabled Legacies Beyond Access and Inclusion is a series that we've been running as part of the Paul Mellon Center's What is Research Now program. That began last summer, where we both take stock of what it means to be artists, writers, scholars, and art workers today. And also challenge some of the assumptions that we make about what research in the arts can be or is. And Disabled Legacies more specifically focuses not only on histories of disability, but ways of thinking, of thriving and being, and how disability justice becomes a method and mode of being. So I'm going to run you through a lot of quite kind of dry, practical, logistical details, so bear with me, but they're important. Before I go into kind of more logistical details, I do want to make the point that one of the reasons that we're here and what we really want from a gathering like this is the ideas shared in the rooms to really leak out and infect an abled world, to show up where decisions are made, policies are written, and worlds envisioned. So, on to the kind of points that we need to kind of just know about. There is a quiet space next door where you will also find a selection of books relating to the themes of the event. They are for reference, so don't take them home. But feel free to browse, and there are some beanbags and comfy seats, so use the space as you want, and you should also feel free to move between the spaces as you need. We have an event information point in the social foyer just outside the space, and there will be a PMC member of staff there at all times if you need anything or have any questions. PMC staff are wearing blue lanyards, so they should be easy to find. The information pack that all of you have picked up upstairs includes eateries in the local area, which you might find helpful in the lunch break. As you will have noticed, live captioning is available throughout, and if you wish to view the captions on your own device, please use the QR code in the event booklet. If you would like to ask a question, there are microphones and blue lanyarded people with microphones walking around. Make sure to use the microphone because this helps capture your question for captioning, and also you can be heard by the online audience. And we also welcome questions from our online audience. So put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and they will be passed on to colleagues in the room. And you will see that they will kind of magically appear on my cell phone, and I will read them out. But having said all that about magic, putting on a fully hybrid event like this has many technical challenges. So we have a lot of speakers joining us virtually today, including our co-convener, Kenny Fries, who I know is poised and ready to go. Hi, Kenny. And it can take a couple of minutes to switch between Zoom and presentations on screen and kind of back and forth and get people muted and unmuted. And I was just behind there with Femi looking at the very complicated screens. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So bear with us as we kind of try to keep things running as smoothly as possible. And also, as many of you know, we're meeting here rather than at the Paul Mellon Center, as it is a more accessible space. But it does mean that we're in a basement, and we're kind of figuring out the technical setup, and since it's not our home turf. And there are other challenges as well. So thanks for being patient with us and working with us through it. It can also feel a bit closed off here because we're in the basement, but the PMC team have lugged our beloved air purifiers over, so it should help keep some of the air fresh. And of course, feel free to wear masks as needed. And speaking of home turf, the Paul Mellon Center is about 5 minutes away, and there is a small and wonderful exhibition called Misfits, curated by Virginia Morano, on at right now. So, and it coincides with the program. I know many of you have been there last night already. Do feel free to stop by during the lunch break or at any other point. The center is closed tomorrow, but the exhibition is on until the 9th of April, and you can come back at any point. We really like having visitors, so come back and see us. Right, so I think that I have run through all the housekeeping, which brings me to the exciting bit, which is to say thank you again to all of you and to my co-conveners, who I will pass the mic on to now.
Thank you so much, Sria. How about we all start with a signed or said good morning in unison? 1, 2, 3. Good morning! Thank you so much. We are one. We are a community. Hi, my name is Khairani Barokka. You can call me Oka. I am so honored and privileged to be a co-convener of the series alongside Sria and Kenny. Hello, Kenny, in Japan. I'm an Indonesian woman wearing a long kabaya with patterns on it that some of my mentees gifted me, and black pants and black shoes, and I have long hair. So I would like to say that last February was one of the most joyful and generative gatherings of deaf and disabled folk I think I've been part of. And I really hope, and I can feel that energy and excitement from everyone here today in some parts. So I'm looking forward to seeing all the ways that you will think and feel through these series of events. I'd like to thank all the support staff who are amazing, Femi, Kathleen, Ella, everyone. And the interpreters, and also the speakers, some of whom have come here from afar, some of whom are zooming in from afar. This entire program, the February and the March series, is dedicated to our gorgeous beloved Alice Wong. Belated, there's recently a memorial for her, and she embodied disability justice in fierce, fierce ways. So just if you don't know, I'm sure you all know here, but disability justice was first coined by queer crip artist of color collective Sins Invalid and expressed in myriad ways by thousands of indigenous cultures prior to. It is a pathway forwards that connects us to past and present. We follow in the wake of disabled, deaf, and or neurodivergent ancestors who have navigated oppression with ingenuity, creativity, and artistry. It is a liberatory way of being and doing applicable to all, and it is our distinct pleasure to present programming that celebrates disability justice's revolutionary theory and practice. To say that we have always aimed to go beyond access and inclusion is a vast understatement. The story of disability justice is one of anti-colonialism and of determination for communities of mutual aid and collaboration to survive together, to create together. We welcome you to this communal reminder of the deep wisdom we inherit and of what all of us may pass on as future ancestors. And I hope you are all as present as possible in your body, minds today and tomorrow. And you all get to meet new people, talk to new people, have conversations, and thoroughly enjoy the programming ahead. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Kenny. Kenny Fries.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi, everyone. I am nighttime here in Japan at Kyoto, which is why I can't be with you in person today. It's good to see you, Oka and Sria, even if virtually. And hi, Tony. How are you?
Good.
So it was also Alice Wong's birthday. I think it was yesterday because of the time difference. It's 13 hours difference between here and the US, so I kind of get the days mixed up. I wanted to just frame the next 2 days like I framed the first days in February by quoting something that I've written that's in the booklet. Access is not only physical access. As necessary as physical access must always include disability representation. by disabled artists, not only in disability-focused projects, but dare I say, in all projects. And I urge us not to use the word inclusion. Inclusion connotes there are people who hold the power to include. Most often, these gatekeepers are non-disabled. Inclusion seems like charity. The very idea of inclusion seems excluding. I just wanted to frame that with those words, and I will be flitting in and out. I'll be watching everything and chairing some events, and then actually tomorrow towards the end doing my own presentation. So have a wonderful time, and thanks for being here, and see you later.
Thank you so much, Kenny. And I know you're not on the screen, but on Zoom and watching us. So I want to introduce the first talk and conversation today. We have Tony Heaton and Ashokkumar Mistry. Full bios of all speakers are in your kind of event packs and online, so I'm not going to kind of do a full read of everything, but I do want to introduce the speaker a little bit. So Tony Heaton has been closely involved with the disability arts movement, both as an artist, activist, and administrator for many years. He initiated NDACA, the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive, and as a consultant and advisor to many organizations, including the British Council. He's a sculptor whose work has been exhibited nationally and internationally and is represented in public collections. He is the chair of Shape Arts and a trustee of the Museums Association, and was awarded an OBE for services to the arts and disability arts movement. And has honorary doctorates and many, many things that I'm not going to go into too much. So Tony is going to give a talk, and then Ashokkumar Mistry will respond and be in charge of also kind of taking questions from the audience and so on. And I'm around for online audiences to read out questions if any of you have them. So Ashokkumar Mistry is a neurodivergent multidisciplinary artist. And he is exhibited at John Hansard Gallery in Southampton and has received commissions from Icon Gallery, Dash Arts, and Dada Fest. Through both his creative and critical work, Mistry continues to expand the possibilities of art as a space for mutual trust, consent, and transformation. So over to Tony and Ashok.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here, and thank you for inviting me. You've given me a task, which is to do a brief history of the UK's disability arts movement. And then you've given me 30 minutes to do it in. So I will inevitably leave things out that you'll be really cross about. But my only defense is that I just didn't have time to squeeze it all in. All right, so you can be critical at the end. I did say to Ashok, I feel a bit like Sisyphus trying to roll this particular rock up a hill. And but I also should say that this is from my own personal perspective as well. So so it's mine to own in that sense, and it's not comprehensive. Anyway, I thought that I don't know whether you can see everything on the screen, but I thought that I'd open up with this extract from the book Disability Politics, and it's, I guess, both authors, Baroness Jane Campbell and Professor Mike Oliver, were hugely influential figures in the history of disability arts and disability politics. And Oliver, alongside Vic Finkelstein, initiated the social model of disability. And that's the bedrock, really, for our understanding of our oppression, I guess. And Jane Campbell was a very articulate campaigner who, with many others, campaigned for the DDA, the first legislation to make it illegal to discriminate against us back in 1995. I'm just going to read what's on the slide. It says, over the centuries, many individual disabled people have fought against the negative and tragic stereotypes foisted upon them by a dominant culture. And one way of fighting back is the personal rejection of the dominant disabling culture A second way is to get involved oneself in cultural production, usually through the arts. So disability arts and culture came flooding into the disability movement back in the 1980s, providing an important channel to promote the newly discovered identity. And I thought that kind of sets out the context of what I'm going to say to you today. And it also recognises a 40-year-old history. But before that, I wanted to take you back to the 1960s. And the Spastic Society, as they were called then, now they're called Scope, they littered the UK high streets with these charity collecting boxes, which are in the slide. And they depicted disabled children as objects of pity and in need of charity. And for most people, they were the only sculptural representation of disabled people in the public realm. And I don't know where I got this from, but David Attenborough may have said that it fascinates me that giving to charities is considered noble and praiseworthy, but creating a society that doesn't require charity is considered socialist and bad. I was going to try and do his accent there, but I thought, no, ditch that, it's a bad idea. Anyway, the social model became the bedrock for disability arts movement, and it turned a negative view of disability into a positive one. And in the mid-1980s, disabled arts forums controlled by disabled people were established in several major cities in the UK. And they nurtured art that made political statements, and they challenged the ways in which disabled people are excluded from having agency over our own lives. But before the mid-1980s, a small number of key organisations began to develop, and namely SHAPE. SHAPE Arts started in 1976, so 50 years ago. And I admit a conflict of interest. As Sria said, I was the chief executive of SHAPE for 10 years, and I'm currently his chair. And we might notice from this slide that language changes over time, but I think being an innovator and a leader within the disability arts field is still SHAPE's objective. Shortly after SHAPE came into being, Grey Eye Theatre Company came into existence. They came in 1980, and this image on screen shows the actor Nabil Shaban in one of his many roles. He kind of challenged the widely held belief that disabled people had no role to play in theatre. And in 1988, Nabil was denied work on Granada TV's Microman, which was a children's TV series, because the executives worried that children would find Nabil frightening. And he fought against this and these negative assumptions all his life. I mean, sadly, he died quite recently. But Grey Eye, as a company, is still thriving, and they describe themselves as a human rights charity, and saying we challenge preconceptions, smash outdated ideology, and empower individuals. We create radical theatre, placing access at the heart of our work. And I just wanted to remind us that in 2012, the director of Grey Eye, Jenny Seeley and Bradley Hemmings, were co-artistic directors of the truly amazing opening ceremonies of the Paralympic Games, which I hope many of you have seen, and really pushed a lot of disabled people into the spotlight and into public consciousness. Other organisations around the UK began to form, and in 1984, after working with SHAPE on a project, Heart and Soul established themselves as an award-winning creative community and arts charity. And they say, we believe in power and talents of people with learning disabilities and autistic people. We work together to make great art with imagination, love and trust. A decade later came Action Space, who described themselves as an exceptional visual arts organisation that supports learning disabled artists. And they include the last Turner Prize winner, Nena Kalu, who's one of their artists. And in 2006, Outside In was established by Mark Steen, and that Outside In provides a platform for artists who encounter significant barriers to the art world due to health, disability, social circumstance or isolation. So we see 50 years on that we've got a continually growing network of allied arts organisations across all art forms who emphasise arts rather than charity. Now, critical to these organisations was the absolute need to record and promote that activity. And mainstream media had got little interest in what we were doing, so we started to create our own. And I still look back on that time with real amazement, because it's a time before mobile phones, before the internet, before money, actually, and by a bunch of disabled people who, according to the mainstream media, kept telling us that we were passive recipients in need of care and control. And their Disability Arts in London, Dale magazine, was launched in 1986. And this small monthly magazine was pretty much the only lifeline to disabled people who were interested in disability arts. So we can kind of pause and see that there was the beginnings of the recognition of disability arts. And by that we mean art made by disabled artists that reflected in some way our lived experience. So this loose infrastructure began to develop with common themes, regional organisations spring up, grassroots activism begins once disabled people start to realise and think politically about their oppression, and that disability was actually more of a social construct rather than just a personal tragedy or a personal issue, and that the barriers for many of us were out there in society, in the environment, and in people's attitudes towards us. And we couldn't get in, and actually they didn't really want us to get in. So as disability arts and politics developed, protests demanded that decisions about disabled people's lives should be determined by disabled people ourselves. We reclaimed the word crip from its negative connotations, and nothing about us without us and piss on pity became our rallying cries. Broadly, the development of disability arts, like many arts movements, can be sort of broken into distinct phases. It could be argued from the late 1970s to the late 1990s, disability arts was predominantly led by the disability protest movement. From 2000 to 2010, disability arts changed focus as Arts Council England began disinvesting in the Disability Arts Forum. And this kind of felt like a good idea at the time, this sort of inclusion dread word came about, but actually disabled artists were then proved to, prove themselves within a mainstream arts sector, and it wasn't physically accessible. And many of the attitudes of the gatekeepers were negative towards our inclusion. Again, sorry, Kenny, dread words. But in 2004, Colin Hambrook set up Disability Arts Online as a networking space for disabled artists and a space to critique disability arts practice. Again, it was informed by the social model, and from 2010 onwards, we've seen a much bigger emphasis on intersectionality. I'm taking you back to the 1990s and a mouthful of water. So in 1991, SHAPE hosted the first ever National Disability Arts and Cultures Seminar. Whenever I see this old monochrome photograph, I'm reminded of the comment that whilst it might be difficult to determine the number of people familiar with abstract expressionism in 1940s New York, it's recognised that it's limited to a very small number of people. And I think you could say the same thing for disability arts in the mid-1980s. And this photograph from 91 is important because it shows many of those people who continued to work within and promote disability art into the future. And just to name check a few: Mike Oliver, Vic Finkelstein, Jane Campbell, Dr. Colin Barnes, who was the Emeritus Professor of Disability Studies at Leeds University, Maggie Woolley, who was the first director of SHAPE and the first deaf woman to present the TV programme See Here on national TV, Alan Sutherland, the poet and writer, Barbara Lazicki, activist, comedian, the late Adam Reynolds, sculptor, and David Heavey, who produced the Disabled Century for BBC TV and is currently CEO of SHAPE. And just to put some historical context around that, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down and apartheid ended in 1994. So hopefully that widens our thinking around what life was like in that time. So this slide says, disability arts grew out of the disability rights movement in the UK, the wider struggle by disabled people for equality and the right to participate in all aspects of society. And in 1995, that struggle resulted in the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, which was a landmark piece of legislation in the UK to protect us against discrimination. And it was a significant step, though enforcement remains a significant challenge. And the Disability Rights Commission was established in 1999, and it was I think it was the third of the UK's equality commissions, alongside the Commission for Racial Equality and the Equal Opportunities Commission. And its chair at that time was a Scouser wheelchair user called Bert Massey. And I always remember this remark when Bert was trying to get a table in a restaurant. I'm not going to do a Scouse accent, but the restaurateur came up to Bert and said, "I'm terribly sorry, sir, we don't serve wheelchairs." To which Bert replied, "That's okay, I don't eat them." And that's kind of, that summarises Bert in many ways for me. Anyway, back to our present century. And I just thought this was an interesting slide to put on. I'll read it. But I used to be the director of an organisation called Halton Lee down in rural Dorset. And this is the driveway up to it. The driveway is about a mile long. But we had this sign by the artist Caroline Cardus right at the start of the drive. And it says, I can't actually read it off there. I have to try and read it off. The headline is Equality, Man on the Moon, I think it says 1969, and then full access to public transport 2020. So I guess, like me, we are still waiting for that to happen. Like we're waiting for our access to work grants to be given to us and our benefits to be reinstated. Anyway, I was Halton Lee's first director back in 1997, and we built this gallery in the slide. In 2001, we finished building it, and we opened it with a conference called DA21. And what we wanted to do was review arts and culture 10 years on from that first SHAPE conference I showed you in the earlier slide. I'd started to already collect work by disabled artists at Halton Lee, and that work eventually became the nucleus for NDACA, the National Disability Arts Collection and Archive, which I'll say a little bit more about later on. But DA21 was a 3-day conference to promote discussion on developments since that first SHAPE conference. And the foreword was written by Quabina Guiedo. He was the development officer for disabled people in the arts at Arts Council England. And he referenced the DDA in his foreword, and he talked about the Arts Capital Lottery programme that was improving access to arts venues. But he reflected that disabled practitioners and disability-led arts organisations had not received equal attention, and not long after that, the Arts Council actually closed down the disability unit. So I leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. And one of the speakers at the conference was Dr. Paul Dark, and he described disability arts as perhaps the last great revolutionary art at humanity's disposal, that it was solely humanitarian and non-ideological in its intent. But at the same conference, disability arts had concluded that our arts, disability arts had been neutered by the funding system, and that disabled artists were being excluded from the mainstream. And I came away thinking that our fragile history that we created was in danger of being lost. And I discussed that with Alan Sutherland and others, and it became obvious that we needed to do something to preserve that. And that idea became the nucleus for the development of NDACA. And in 2008, I left SHAPE, I left Halton Lee to take up post at SHAPE. And shortly after that, the NDACA project followed me. Before I talk about that, I wanted to just show this slide of the sculpture by Mark Quinn, which was the first, it was the first publication to focus on the evolution of disability arts over. The sculpture is of Alison Lapper pregnant, and it was on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square. And Quinn observed that there was no positive representation of disability in the history of public arts. And it struck him, he was in the British Museum, and he was looking at people, looking at the fragmented marble statuary. And he thought, if real people with bodies like these appeared in the gallery, then the admirers would have the opposite reaction. And I remember Alison Lapper, whilst she was pregnant, and the subject of the sculpture, saying that she was in a pharmacy and two women in her presence were discussing whether it was right for her to be having a child, expressing disapproval at the burden she would have on society by collecting benefits. And the London Evening Standard, apparently forgetting that this work was of a living human being, carried a picture saying, "Is this really what we want on Trafalgar Square's empty plinth?" And the journalist, Deborah Orr, said, people love the statue, but would they coo at the image if it was on their scan? So, back to Strength. So this was published at the same time, 2007, and Strength was the first in-depth publication to focus on the evolution of disability arts over 2 decades. And the chapters in the book explore a series of narratives about disabled artists challenging ableism within society. Its author was the late Paddy Masefield, and he became disabled whilst he was on the National Lottery Committee, and he did much to ensure that lottery money went to provide non-negotiable access towards any capital improvements to the UK's major arts buildings. And that was just a pure stroke of luck, a pure stroke of chance. And it sort of shows the tenuousness of how change comes about, really. So in 2009, the disabled artist Liz Crowe, like Quinn, exhibited on the 4th plinth. But she was there in person, and she was dressed as a Nazi, and she was highlighting Action T4, which was the mass murders of disabled people who were the first people to be exterminated. And this largely goes unrecognised or remembered, but it's thought to number in excess of 300,000 disabled people. Now, I searched on Told Internet for the 4th plinth, and I saw loads and loads of images, far too many of Boris Johnson, actually, but I couldn't find any of Liz's performance. Now, I know it happened because I was there and I witnessed it, but is it recorded like everybody else's? Well, I'm afraid not. Have a search, see what you think. And sadly, at this time, the disabled sculptor Adam Reynolds died, and his family asked Shape to help support a bursary, first at Camden Arts Centre, with the money that was raised at Adam's memorial. And this was very successful. And we thought if we could sustain it as an annual award, it would be a great opportunity for a disabled artist, and also an opportunity to put a disabled artist into a mainstream gallery. And that bursary continues to this day. And the first recipient was Naomi Lackmeyer, who is in the image on the slide. And the current recipient is David Johnson, who sat in the front row. And his work's showing at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds with massive mainstream publicity, actually. I'm sure many people will have seen that. And just a quick slide, a burst of present day, and this is David Shaw at Henry Moore Institute, which runs until the 19th of April. And these are some of the thousands of ceramic braille biscuits he made, one of which sits on my desk. And it's a great show, and it's well worth a visit. Okay, I'm taking you back to 2010 now. And Shape received a 25 grand award from LOCOG, the London Organising Committee of the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. And we commissioned 4 works from disabled artists, and we staged a showcase on the South Bank and in the Royal Festival Hall over the bank holiday. It became the catalyst for our inclusion into the 2012 Cultural Olympiad. And as I said earlier, the fantastic work that Jenny Seeley and Bradley Hemmings did with the opening ceremonies for the Paralympic Games, which I'm sure you'll all remember. Following the success of 2012, Shape were commissioned to develop with Arts Admin a programme of work by disabled artists to be branded Unlimited. And this was another successful programme that we led on. And again, Unlimited continues now as an independent organisation. And coincidentally, this image on screen, which we used in the marketing for Unlimited, I showed in that Faith House Gallery that you saw in the earlier slide back in Dorset in 2002. Again, fantastic piece of artwork. And now I'm going to just do a quick shameless plug, because Channel 4 TV commissioned me to make this sculpture for the 2012 Games, and it's called Monument to the Unintended Performer. It celebrates all those Crips who were not in the Paralympics, you know, the unintended performers who just were trying to get on a bus and were routinely stared at as they tried to overcome the barriers of a disabling world. But obviously I didn't tell Channel 4 Telly of the title until it was actually built and launched. But interestingly, at this time, Shape's success on the back of the Games had pushed against funders' doors who had been reluctant to fund Endaka, but this time it opened. And this slide, I'll just read, this was the CEO of the Heritage Lottery Fund at the time, and she said, "We're delighted to be giving initial support for Shape's ambitious and thoughtful plans to tell the story of disability arts, a story that has never been fully and properly told before, and it's particularly timely after last September's Inspiring Paralympics." So, you know, notice the Paralympics, suddenly via TV, you know, disability was in the spotlight. And I think Channel 4 hadn't actually anticipated the popularity, because I had to shift loads of stuff off their schedules to show more and more of the Paralympics. And I think decision makers always underestimate the power of disability. They don't seem to recognise that 20% of us, 20% of the population are disabled people, and pretty much everybody will have a member of their family or a friend or someone they know who's a disabled person. So back to a Sisyphus moment and that 10-year gestation period to establish Endaka, which was really difficult, but I think because funders really didn't get it sufficiently, and in many ways it was an idea before its time, but it did come about. And this is a tricky slide because it builds, too technical for me. So it says Endaka lives at the Bucks New University, which is in High Wycombe, a fully accessible library wing, a repository for artworks, and the catalogue and website lives there. Endaka catalogue details and describes some 3,000 deposits made by disabled artists, activists and thinkers, and it includes around 3,500 high-resolution digital images and personal stories. And the Endaka's the first in the world project that started to collect what has been called the golden age of disability arts, and all that early chaotic and exciting grassroots activity that would have been lost in time without Endaka existing. And it includes a complete run of the UK's 2 journals devoted entirely to disability arts, and the records of the UK's disability arts forums, and the especially commissioned chronology. And of course, it's led by disabled people and supported by disabled people. And we add records each year. And you can find it on that website, the Endaka-endaka.org. I can give you the details afterwards. I think I might have flicked on. Oh, no, that's okay. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to scoot us straight to 2024. And running alongside the world-famous Venice Biennale was DAM in Venice, Disability Arts Movement in Venice, called Crip Art Spazio, developed by Shape Arts, and it was the first exhibition of work by disabled artists to ever show at the Venice Biennale to a worldwide audience, and many seeing disability arts for the very first time. These are just some images. And the show ran for almost a year in Venice, and then it transferred to the Attenborough Arts Centre in Leicester, which is a major mainstream gallery that actively promotes the work of disabled artists, as does the Art House in Wakefield and the Grundy Art Gallery in Blackpool. And these galleries see work for what it is. It's exciting, it's work that connects with people, it's democratic, and it's open. And the exhibiting artists were Jamisha Prescott, who I think's talking tomorrow, Terence Birch, Tanya Raba-Weber, Jason Wilshire Mills, Abby Palmer, co-all work, and the late Keith Armstrong. And his work is supported by NDMAC, which is the National Disability Movement and Archive and Collection, which I'll now try and explain. So, 2026 coming next. Basically, NDMAC is the heritage story of disabled activism, and it's two of a number of disability-led organisations document disabled people's history and culture. And there's also the new Disability Arts Online project called Cripping Culture and the Disabled People's Archive. And NDMAC is collecting and interpreting the heritage story of the disability rights movement and those individual struggles. It tells a story through oral histories, interviews, photographs, documents, video, and also striking protest badges, banners and T-shirts. And the collections will continue to welcome disabled and non-disabled users and supply materials for exhibitions, art galleries, museums and university. And it looks back probably to the 1970s through the passing of the DDA in 95, right up to the present day. And the UK's disability arts movement is internationally recognised as a cultural movement, and it combines art and activism to affect change, and we intend to keep it that way. So, I want to end with this slide. It's something that Jane Campbell, who is the patron of NDACA, and she said, the disability arts movement has always been and always will be a key driver in the fight for disabled people's rights in the UK. The NDACA demonstrates how vital disability arts and culture is to our liberation and informs our continued struggle to be equal citizens and long overdue and very welcome. So I thought I'd close with her statement. And that was a quick overview. I just about kept it in time. So 40 years of lived history. Like Sisyphus, I probably failed. But if you want to know more, check out the websites of the collections. And thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Tony. An amazing kind of roller coaster through disability arts history. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Okay. It really reminds me of an acronym that I came up with, which is RA, which is something that I kind of consider when I'm exploring kind of the way in which people consider each other. And RA stands for when you come up against someone with a difference to you, are you repelling them? Are they being repelled? Are they being allowed? Are they being accepted? Or are they being anticipated? And this story really shows us that kind of that narrative of trying to kind of make space to kind of work towards being anticipated and not just being accepted or allowed, and certainly not being repelled. And it's a story of kind of learning by making, but also learning by being. What's really significant is, I mean, you were talking about the charities earlier as well, and the fact that it was the charities that were kind of controlling the narrative of disabled people. And what we tend to forget is when another entity controls your identity and your sense of being, what's actually happening is as a group of people, you're being separated off. All the different people with different disabilities were kept separate. And it's when they actually come together that they actually start to form what we can see as a real fist to actually kind of move forward. I wanted to start with this question of kind of activism. So your work, Shaken Not Stirred, is such a vivid act, throwing a prosthetic leg. I've got a photograph in this book here. So, So there's a pyramid of charity tins, and you threw a prosthetic leg at those charity tins, and this is back in the
91?
91, yeah.
Heady days.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that gesture and how it landed at the time and in the middle of the Block Telethon campaign?
Yeah, well, heady days indeed. I mean, I was a young hippie, you know, believe it or not, I had long black curly hair and I was slim. And, you know, not the tragic figure you see in front of you right now. But there was a terrible thing on telly called Telethon. And it's basically a program, for those old enough to remember it, it supported the careers of the fading D-list celebrities of the time. And they decided to resurrect their careers by begging on behalf of disabled people. We didn't ask them to beg on our behalf. And we were totally against it. We protested against it. And there was a press conference and thought it would be a good idea. I was thinking, a lot of my work was based on this idea of the charity model and how do we deconstruct this, back to the David Attenborough remark. And I thought, well, why don't I build a pyramid? So it's 7 foot high. It consists of 1,760 odd red charity collecting cans. And there was a full-length prosthetic leg, which had a Doc Martin boot with a steel toe cap on it, sat on a chair in sort of isolation, and so people wandering past thinking, why is there a leg sat on this chair? Anyway, in the middle of the press conference, I sort of swept into the room, picked up the leg, and threw it into this pyramid. And it was a really big echoey room, and it just went down and made this terrific noise. And then I just wheeled out. So it was kind of, it was a performance for, you know, performance art. So it was a piece of performance art. But it was also filmed by BBC Television. And it was one of the first programs that actually had subtitling. So the words lived on the screen, and I've made art out of that, images off that screen. Is that what you were asking me? I've forgotten what the question was now.
It was kind of more about the time, the feeling of actually kind of...
The emotional.
Yeah, the emotional feeling of that act and how it actually came down, how it was received.
Well,
and so on.
It was kind of our Berlin Wall, you know. We, as you said, you know, quite rightly, disability was separated out into impairments. I mean, in 1980, there was the medical model, which was about categorization and determining who was lesser than whom. And we were, as you say, when we all come together, we suddenly went, well, it doesn't matter what your impairment is, because for a lot of the barriers that we come up against aren't around our impairments. They're around, sorry, no, I thought you were saying, don't say that. Okay. So we protested against it. Luckily, we didn't have mobile phones, so we couldn't just sit on our armchairs and go, oh, this is crap. We had to get up and do something, you know, and we went to the television studio. And they thought we were just all, hey, it's so great, here we are cheering. And then in the middle of it, we also ripped our shirts off with piss on pity and, you know, nothing about us without us. And Chris Tarrant, who some of you may remember, just couldn't get his head round why we were stopping the TV and all this money coming towards us. Yeah. You know. You want to ask a question? Okay.
I have a question from one of the online audience members, and I think it's kind of directly to what you're saying, so it'd be a good moment to ask it. Jenny Gristock asks, how did the establishment respond? And I think this is kind of interesting also because we've been talking about the past and the present and the kind of difference between the 1990s and now in relation to sort of performance art activism and kind of gatherings and spaces. So that'd be really good to hear from you, Tony.
Well, it was direct action. And Bob Lazicki, who was in that photograph, started something called the Direct Action Network, Dan, you know, Desperate Dan, and they did cabaret stuff. But there were loads of stories of, you know, disabled people going into Parliament. And again, Parliament thinking, oh, look, all nice poor old cripples are coming in to look at us great politicians. And of course, we people charged the wool sack or whatever it's called in Parliament. And we brought the traffic to a halt in Trafalgar Square. And I remember an incident where somebody who was double amputee had chained himself under a bus, and he'd loosened his legs, and the police got hold of each leg and started to pull him out from under the bus. And then these legs just started to appear, and no guy came out. He was still chained underneath, and the cops had just got these legs, like, what the hell? You know, so there was lots of, you know, another guy, double amputee, was just so incredibly physical. And he leapt on top of one of the police vans. He just sort of leapt out of his wheelchair onto the bonnet and then up onto the roof. And he was like just this agile figure on top of it, you know, waving his hands about. I mean, there were heady days, you know, no two ways about it, you know. Yeah, we were young, naive, foolish.
And it really kind of goes into that narrative of the reaction to being repelled, the reaction to being repelled by society.
However toothless the DDA is, there wouldn't have been a DDA without disabled people taking direct action. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Yeah. Just on that note, this is kind of going sideways a little bit. Could you see a change when it went from the DDA to the Equalities Act?
Yeah, it went in steep reverse. Because what happened with the Equality Act in 2010 is that all those different, you know, the Disability Rights Commission was disbanded. We stopped talking about the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, because we had to talk about the Equality Act. And disability suddenly became the last in the queue again. And it's virtually impossible to bring a case, to bring an action, because it's too expensive, you know. Reasonable adjustments is a phrase that lawyers love because they can argue on the head of a pin about what a reasonable adjustment is. And whilst they're arguing, their bank balances are racking up, you know. And we get very little justice without persuasion and direct action, you know.
So just moving on a little bit and looking at Great Britain from a wheelchair, it has, as a repudiation of the value judgment embedded in the object itself. I'm just going to show you an image of that.
Great Britain from a Wheelchair was on the first slide.
Yeah, so it's this, it's made up of parts of wheelchairs, and it creates a map of Great Britain.
Can I just say there's a couple of copies of the catalogue of my current exhibition, which is just on that table. If anybody wants, there's not many, but if you want some, they're there. If you want to look at them or take them, please do. Sorry, Ashok.
It's all right. How do you work with the aesthetics of disability, using materials and artifacts of impairment without slipping into the very pity narratives you're critiquing?
Yeah, well, where do I start with that? Well, I guess the material is just material. They happen to be two old, condemned ex-ministry wheelchairs, which were my material for the work. So what I hope that I did was transmute that base metal into something else, into a piece of sculpture, which when they were reorganised, kind of made an outline map of Great Britain. So it's called, you know, I like puns in my title, so it's called Great Britain from a Wheelchair, which is a map of Great Britain made out of all wheelchairs. So it's a bit of a jigsaw. And somebody described it as one of those 3D things. You either see it or you see it in 3D, and it depends what distance you get when you're looking at it.
And there's lots of different kind of connotations. There's lots of different interpretations, I guess, of that work as well. And it's something that has spoken about the presence of disability across the UK and the different ways in which you can kind of consider disability in the context of Britain. But if we...
I mean, somebody said, for them it said, we are everywhere. We are everywhere in this country. Can I just... I don't want to break the thread, but because in my presentation I didn't really show much artwork, so I put some slides together that I thought might be able to roll round. I don't know, Femi, whether we can run those slides or not. Are we able to make them pop up on screen? If we can, that would be great. I just felt bad that it was all about organisations and structures and statistics, and we didn't see a lot of art. So I thought if we flick this on.
We need to move on.
How long have we got? Well, that's outrageous. How dare we be out of...
Yeah.
Yeah. We could just leave these on, can't we? Even just let them run till the next presentation or something.
Should we take questions?
I love it when we're out of time. It's great.
Hi, thank you, Tony.
Oh, thank you as well. Your show, Paul Mellon, is fantastic, and I really urge everybody to go and see it at some point.
Thank you, Tony. I had a question about the Creep Arte Spazio in Venice,
Yes.
because I went there and I thought it was so powerful in the way that we can think about collective activity to reshape like the meaning of art events, especially like the very kind of normative and well-established biennials as the Venice Biennial, and I thought it was super powerful because it was in the Giudecca, so it was in a bit of like peripheral location close to the women's prison where the Holy Pavilion actually took place, but the Vatican Pavilion was completely inaccessible because you had to book it in advance, and so just like the very so-called important people could have access to that, but it was impossible for the public to enter. And so I was wondering whether, like, how you position yourself as a collective within the biennial, and how was it working for you within this institutional establishment, and if there is any also future project as we are approaching the opening of the next biennial.
Oh, thanks, Ginny. I mean, yes, there will be another one. There's nobody from the Arts Council in the room, is there? But if there is, you know, give us your money. As somebody once famously, well, they added an expletive, which I won't. But, you know, it depends on money, doesn't it? And Giudecca, I think, is a great bit of Venice. But, I mean, Venice is the most inaccessible place in the world, pretty much. And so it's another Sisyphus moment, trying to get around Venice, you know, roll in your wheelchair, not up a hill in this case, but over a bridge or onto a vaporetto. And again, space on Venice is so in demand. So to get space anywhere is an absolute nightmare. And to find an accessible space, with an accessible loo, of course, you know, was our primary aim. So and it's a big, for people who've not been, it's a big boatyard building. So it's got level access, and but like everywhere on Venice, you've got to jump on a vaporetto and jump off a vaporetto to get to Giudecca, which is, I think, a beautiful bit of Venice because it's actually where a lot of Venetians live. It's kind of off the tourist trail. But the Biennale is everywhere, isn't it? It's all over the place. So it's not like there is a couple of nucleuses, the Arsenale and the Giardini. But other than that, it's all over the place. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
We have a question at the back.
Hiya.
Hi, I had a quick question about display of your art and the conversations you have with curators and exhibition makers, especially those who aren't a part of the disabled community.
Yes.
Like conversations about display and labels and how to work in the space.
Yes.
So, yeah.
That's a great question, and it's an easy answer. I tell them exactly how to curate my exhibitions. I tell them exactly how high things should be and where they should be positioned. But I tell them in a way that they then believe that it's their idea. And that's how it works. Is that too arrogant an answer? Probably.
No,
But it's a
makes
conversation.
Yeah.
But, you know, sensible curators recognise that you're the expert in access and your work. So if they want to get the best out of the show, then the dialogue should be mutual dialogue rather than a curator determining how the work should be. David, have you got a question? It's not up to me, but I'd say yes. No, I'm getting nods. So I think people will just leave if they want to leave.
It's just really a question about...
You've got a mic in front of you.
Sorry, right.
No problem.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, so it's just a question about visibility. You said earlier that disabilities everywhere, ubiquitous, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But so why is it still so invisible, relatively speaking? And how, in the contemporary world, do we raise that visibility and make it visible for far more people than it is now? Is there still a place for the direct action that you described?
Oh, I think so, absolutely.
Do you think so? Right.
Yeah. I think the reason it's hidden is through politeness and the sort of reserve of people to have an honest dialogue. People are frightened of saying the wrong things, and it almost becomes some sort of the unspoken thing that nobody speaks about. So I think we have a responsibility to be fairly forward thinking in what our requirements are. That we talked about misfits, and Ginny's exhibitions about misfits, and we do sort of have to embrace being misfits in a way to sort of express what our requirements are, and that should be perfectly reasonable and legitimate. So I think we've got to do that, and the gatekeepers have got to listen because we know what we're talking about, and they've got to believe that, which I think they sometimes are in disbelief that we might actually know more than they do.
So the onus is on us, on the disability community, disabled community then?
Well, I think it's on us as individuals, I guess. Yeah. I don't speak for a community.
If I can just kind of interject a little bit, I think there is, when we talk about visibility, a lot of it is to do with expectations, and it's a narrative that's been created based on expectations and people kind of towing to those expectations. When we talk about visibility of disabled artists, then we need to start looking at the way art is taught and the way curators are taught, and it's only then that the thing's going to change. So it's not necessarily just the kind of the responsibility of disabled artists. It's everyone's responsibility. Disability is part of the human condition. It's not something that's separated. As Amanda Kashir says, disability is a club that anyone can join any point in their life. So
everyone will join it.
Yeah. There's a question in the middle towards the back.
Hello. Oh my gosh, I forgot how much I hate hearing my voice on the mic. I have a question. I don't remember what exactly was said because I have very delayed processing, but there was a comment about activism before phones, or phones as we know them today. So I'm curious about the current activism landscape in a social media heavy and device heavy world, and your thoughts on the change from activism before that time and activism now, whether you think it's positive, negative, neutral, just thoughts about the changing climate. That's a loaded question, sorry.
But no, it's a really interesting question. You're addressing it to somebody who's a complete, I haven't got a clue about social media. I make mistakes with it all the time. I need to find 12-year-old people to sort of sort me out. And probably Ashok's in a better position okay. You're the same. I'm completely lost with social media. I don't know what I'm liking, what I'm not liking, what's art and what's pornography, really. I mean, what happens on my phone, just no idea. If anybody can be more helpful, I don't know. The thing that I kind of regret in a way is that before social media, we had to get together and do things as a community. Our rage was expressed in human form, whereas now, we think we get excited because we've got thousands of likes or whatever, but I'm not sure anything ever changes as a result of that. But I might be wrong. I don't know.
I think it's as much about looking for bridges, not bubbles. I think if probably leave that conversation there. We can make of that what we want.
I think other people at the break will answer that question for you.
Yeah.
They'll be a lot younger than me and Ashok, if you don't mind me saying so.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here and everyone online, and thank Tony for...
and thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And sorry to keep you waiting. All right.
Cheers.